Okay, how many of you, were any of you at the session that I led this morning? No one. Okay, well that's nice, that's good. How many of you are administrators? How many teachers? Okay, so this morning we had a session where we dealt with how to help your teachers love classical education. And we went over several tools that we can use to introduce our teachers more deeply to classical education. Sorry you missed it, but you know, that happens. Do we have 2 more chairs for 2 more people somewhere? Here's 1 chair. Do you have a chair for you? There's the teacher chair. How about that? Right. You're powerful at this, as soon as you sit in that chair, you're powerful. So what I wanted to say to anyone who had been in that session, which they didn't, but I'm going to say it anyway, is that session was more tools that we use to do the things we need to do, right, in classical education. It was equipping teachers to make sure that they were doing everything they could classically for themselves and their students, and also heads of school likewise, right? And so often we come to a conference and we have the big picture and we hear truth, beauty, goodness, and we're all inspired. And then we go back to our schools and then everyone says, but what about in the classroom? How do we do that, right? So basically my job is I work with schools in the West, and I go around to schools and we do curriculum and we do the nuts and bolts of the classroom. But I am a former head of a classical Christian school from Arizona. So what we're talking about today, the thing that brought you in, was you saw this title, The Importance of Wisdom and Virtue in Our Schools. So this morning's session was more toolbox oriented. This session is more big thought oriented, although there will be some tool things within it. So I just want to get your minds in that place, okay? So we talk, and I think it's interesting that Dr. Clark had mentioned this, because we talk so much about our 3 sacred words, truth, beauty, goodness, right? We talk about those words all of the time. But we need to be careful, because in our society, because of the way we have been educated, because I would assume all of us here were educated progressively if you went to a public school when you were growing up. And even if you went to a Christian school, much of that mindset has been affected by progressivism. So we always have to watch ourselves that we don't just grab something and continually want to do that and not think. We have to be careful. We have to be a thinking people, right? Within the last 2 years, there's been a lot of non-thinking going on. So this morning, I got in the elevator to go downstairs, and my phone, I left it in the other building, and I'm kind of proud of myself about that. But anyway, and it had in the elevator hand sanitizer on the wall, and above it it said, please use this disinfectant, this will keep you healthy, and it's very important. And then the hand sanitizer was empty. And I just said, well, if that isn't just a picture of where things have been, I mean, this is what we've lived in. So we want to know what we're about, and we want to be thinkers. We don't want to just be silly running towards something because somebody said something. And it will be a tendency for us, because we saw this in the Christian school movement that came out of the 1970s. We saw a lot of stuff come out of there that wasn't good as far as direction. I mean, yes, everybody loved God, but that's not where it ends, right? You don't just love God and memorize John 3:16. We have to go farther than that, right? So, now it came to pass, as they went, that he'd entered into a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha received him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, which also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was cumbered about with much serving, and came to him and said, Lord, dost thou not care that my sister hath left me to serve alone? Bid her therefore that she help me. And Jesus answered and said unto her, Martha, Martha, thou art careful and troubled about many things, but one thing is needful. And Mary hath chosen that good part, which shall not be taken away from her. And I would say to each of you, you have chosen the good part, and that cannot be taken from you. You don't make a lot of money, and sometimes you have rough days, but you have chosen the good part. And in this crazy, crazy, chaotic world that we live in, that is the very best thing to do. So think about that in your situation. Quintilian tells us, we should not speak so that it is possible for the audience to understand us, but so that it is impossible for the audience to misunderstand us. So I want to do that for you today. I want to speak to you about the work that you are all involved in, and that is the work of creating a beautiful education and restoring virtue and wisdom in our schools and thus in our culture. You are doing the good part. There are those in this world who would turn up their nose at what each of you are attempting. They think you're silly, and it's all foolishness. But you know, one thing that I noticed in the last couple of years more than ever is that we have hope, and the other side doesn't. They're just defeated. Woe is me, the world's going to end. It's all terrible. But we have hope. We know how it comes out in the end, right? And so we are not defeated. The world looks down on hope these days and is much more comfortable with expecting the worst. Is that not true? But we are not of that ilk. As Christians, it is in our very nature to hope, for hope maketh not ashamed. We are known to spout the mantra, hope springs eternal, and that stems directly from our Judeo-Christian roots. Hope springs eternal. We do not realize how unusual it is to have that thought process in our country because we have grown up with that. But I will tell you that in the country of Russia, our son-in-law is Russian. Our daughter was teaching in Russia when she met her husband. Do you know what they say? They never say hope springs eternal. They say hope is the last thing to die. 70 years of communism will do that to you, right? Hope is the thing with feathers that perches in the soul and sings the tune without the words and never stops at all. Who wrote that? Does anyone know? Emily Dickinson, yes. She's right. Hope is not to be crushed. As Christians, we dare to hope, and in that hope, we find freedom. And of course, our main hope is in Christ. This year, we were taken by surprise by so many things. And I sometimes felt like we had entered another world. I'm sure you did too. Sort of dystopian universe where all that was right was wrong and vice versa. And by the way, vice versa is Latin. For those of you who don't believe in having Latin in your schools, you need it. Status quo, verbatim. Do you want anything else? They're all Latin. A world where every man did what was right in his own eyes. This world we've been in. Then there was no clear thinking to be found. And we were even questioning ourselves. I think this, but maybe I'm wrong. And just really not healthy. It would have been easy to despair. But God, right? No matter what, but God. I read a book this past year entitled The Unbroken Thread. Has anyone read that book? It is a book by Sohrab Ahmari, S-O-H-R-A-B, is his first name, Ahmari, A-H-M-A-R-I. He's Persian. And his book is talking about when we do away with tradition, we end up with chaos. When we do away with structure and order, we end up with chaos. When we do away, I'll give you a little translation for America in the present day. When we do away with the police, we end up with a mess, right? So he writes in his book about Maximilian Colby. You know Father Colby. I don't know if any of you know his story, but if you don't, you're going to hear it. And if you do, you're going to hear it again. Maximilian Colby was a Polish priest, and he was arrested during World War II, and he was put in Auschwitz. And one of the prisoners in the night had tried to escape. And so to punish everyone and make them not even think in that way, the soldiers chose 10 men, and they put them in a room, and they wanted to keep order in the camp, and so they're choosing out the men to go in this room, and they're going to starve to death. And Maximilian Colby steps up, and he doesn't know any of the men, but he says, I'll take the place of one of those men. He knew that man had a family. And so he took the man's place, and now the 10 prisoners were placed in the room to starve to death. And they were given no food and no water. And the days went by, and they got up to 2 weeks, and all of the men were dead except for Father Colby. And when these soldiers came in to annihilate him, he smiled at them, and he had a look of peace on his face. And then they shot him. What made Maximilian Colby give his life for another? When he was a small child, his mother surrounded him with the Holy Scriptures. He was brought up surrounded by Scripture. He was brought up to be taught to develop wisdom in his life, and that wisdom that he found in Scripture produced virtue. And that is what made him able to die for others. Do we have that? Are we putting that in our classrooms? We can talk about classical education and all the little things that we like to say about it. But the truth of it is, it's the heart, it's the soul, right? It's wisdom and virtue. So the man who wrote this book, and he talks about Maximilian, he named his little boy, who was 2 years old, Max. And Amari says, I live in New York City, I live in Manhattan. And my son doesn't see that. I wonder if he grows up, if he'll be like Maximilian Colby, because it's really hard in our world today. And that's true. But not to lose hope. You are the people who are going to change that. So how does it relate to school or classrooms? Well, it's the training, isn't it? That very thing that you will be doing that you are doing in your classrooms. You are training children. You are helping them to grow wise, and what comes from being wise is virtuous living, right? If you know what is good and you understand that, then you are more likely to live virtuously. We start in kindergarten by teaching our kindergartners to respect one another, to let the other person go first. It's training throughout the years, right? We don't just arrive as an adult and say, okay, now you need to be wise. We train throughout the years. Every culture has its traditions. So I'm sure each of you can think of your own family. You have certain traditions that maybe your family has done over the years. We have traditions in our culture of when we meet someone shaking hands, right? Our wedding vows, that's a traditional thing that we do. We all have different traditions. But what happens when we throw out all of those traditions? We have chaos. And so we'll have no structure, we'll have no guidance if we throw out these things that are good. If we were, and I have spoken to people who have said everything new is good, everything old needs to go. And that's a dangerous, dangerous place to be when you eschew the old and only go to the good, or to the new, because the new is not necessarily good. My father had a saying, progress is always change, but change is not always progress. And that's true, isn't it? It's very, 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 very true. So what is the result? If we do not have order, we end up and you'll see this in classrooms that are not teacher-directed and not guided, and a school that is not guided by a strong head of school, you will end up with moral illiteracy. What is moral illiteracy? Not even knowing what is right and wrong. You know, families are in such a state in these days, and I'm sure in many of your schools you have children who spent half of the week with mom and half with dad, or, you know, these are difficult situations, right? That produces moral illiteracy too. I don't know what's right or wrong because my life is a mess. I'm being raised everywhere, right? So your job becomes very, very big in the lives of these children. Not because of who we are, but because of the work that we do, right? It's not about us, it's about the work that we do. Children raised in the climate where the nuclear family dissolves really struggle. And we've seen social mores change. We have really, really seen that. Our present societal behavior is heavily influenced by the preceding generations. The turn to progressive education led by John Dewey and his cohorts, the downward spiral led by the rebellion of the 60s, and proceeding to our present technology-driven age. And if you don't think technology is hurting your students and yourself, you better look into it and think again. There's so much being done through too much technology. So that is why the phone is in the other building. Actually, it's there because I forgot it, but it's okay. There is a great disregard for tradition, and yet those very traditions lent a form and structure to our classrooms and our culture. So we have in progressive education people saying that children should feel good in the classroom and let them do as they wish, and no, don't. Don't let them do as they wish. I think we could all understand we're all hopeless, helpless sinners. And we as the big people are here to guide and train the little people so they can grow up to be big people. They will not perennially be teens or little children. They're going to grow up. So we need to train them for that, right? I'm reading a book right now, and if you, Eighth Day carries this, but he says he's out of it today, but you can order it from him, Solzhenitsyn. Joseph Pierce is a great biographer. He does some work for us at Memoria Press, but this is a great book. I don't know if any of you in the 70s, I know you're giving away your age and I'm giving away my age. Do you remember when Solzhenitsyn comes to the United States and hearing about that? No one? Yeah. It's kind of sad that he sort of faded. Well, he died in 98, but that 98 or 2007 maybe, but that he's faded into oblivion because right now with Ukraine and Russia and the whole thing going on, like this totally explains it. And he says, but very interesting, so I'm reading this, and he says in 1971, as he's seeing Russia change, well, and he sees the hatefulness towards Christians, and he sees that the young people are just looking down on Christianity, and he sees how sad it is to look down on the old, right, just because it's old. And how proud a person would be to think that the new is always better. That's saying, I know more than all the people who came before me. And that's just pride. It's just wrong. It's like in our education where we say, just do creative writing. I'm sorry, no. You don't even know how to write. Somebody better teach you, which is why we have defined writing courses. I don't know if any of you use the ProGym, but you know, you're going step by step in learning how to write, because this just doesn't come upon us. Jesus was a teacher. Teaching is important. We need someone to guide us. So anyway, I just thought that was interesting as I was reading that. I just thought, yes, he's saying everything that we are seeing right now. There is a great work to be done in our schools as we seek to reintroduce wisdom and virtue. In your classrooms, you will be the ones to oversee the students and direct their schooling. Much falls on your shoulders. As you have been given this grand opportunity, it is a calling in that sacred place that we call a classroom. You will find along the way that not only are your students becoming different people, but that you are changing also. You cannot read the old and the good. without becoming another person. You see, ours is not a path that leaves us unaffected. What we are as we begin this beautiful, although not always easy, journey is not what we will be later on. Progressive educators tell us it is wrong to teach our students there is a right or wrong. Yet they feel no guilt in defining what they think is right and wrong. I will mention the elephant in the room, critical race theory. They feel it's right. And they will tell us this is right, and we will tell them it is wrong. They are not afraid to say what they think, and we ought not to be afraid to say what we think. What has this to do with classical Christian education? Everything. For this excellent education, this very old education, is an education designed by God. And while we know our students will partake of excellent learning, our most important work is that of preparing an environment where the human soul is ministered to, where wisdom is learned and virtue exhibited. It's such a contrast to think of the progressive mentality in say a public school, which they're progressive. You do not get that understanding, that thought process of ministering to a human soul. That's huge, right? So how sad that has been taken out of the public arena. Why do we read the classics? Why do we learn Latin or teach logic or memorize scripture or seek to develop the mind? The end goal is virtue, and that is not easily accomplished. It is not a utilitarian endeavor. The whole picture of classical education goes against the present culture, for we are full of hope in a desperately flawed and failing society. All might seem lost except for this. We believe. Take that in your soul. You believe. We believe that a beautiful education is a given when we follow the plan God has laid out for us, and there is beauty all around us as we retrace the steps of old. It is not hiding from truth, but rather reaffirming of it. A commitment to all that is true and good and beautiful from God's perspective, not our own. Communitas, that is the Latin word meaning the sense of community. And that is developed within a group of people who are united by a common belief. And this is why we have conferences, because we're united, we're kindred spirits, we should be. United by a common belief. It's very, very good. That is what classical educators need to be. United by the belief that what we are doing is good work, the most important work, the work of educating the human soul, for we are not just minds. And I think we can sometimes get caught in the mind thing. But we are not just minds. We are bodies and souls. And so, in this beautiful education, each is ministered to. But how do we do it? How do we, in each of our schools, create this beautiful education? When one is lost in the woods, C.S. Lewis says, one should look to a signpost, right? Education is in a state of decay and disrepair, and it would seem that all is lost, that our very culture is vanishing, and yet we hope. And there is another great quote from our friend, dear friend Chesterton. He says, "The true soldier fights not because he hates what is in front of him, but because he loves what is behind him." Think that through. We are in a battle for truth in our present age. And I just want to go rabbit trailing for a moment. We are so in a battle for truth and have been for the last 100 to 150 years. I mean, always, because there's always the fight of good and evil. But with progressive education. You look at the 50s, where whole language skills come into the schools. Whole language is a spiritual attack. And I know you're saying, oh boy, she's taking that far, but think it through. What did whole language do? It said you can't have phonics where a letter has one or two sounds. You can't define that. You can't say it can only say that. We're going to do whole language where you look at a picture of a horse and the word says horse, but if the child says pony, well, it's okay because, I mean, it could be either one, right? So there's no truth there. So we've tossed truth out the window. No, D only says duh. It's never going to say anything else. And when we threw whole language in there in the 50s, that was attacking truth in education. And everybody just said, oh, that feels so good. I think we'll just go right down that path. And now we have to resuscitate the whole thing. And we have a couple of generations of people who hate to read because they never learned how to read properly. And so, you know, that's how education attacks truth at times. So when we say truth, beauty, goodness, it's not just spiritual truth, but it's actually the act of teaching that attacks truth. So just thinking that through, and every bit of education really helps us. By providing an honest education, an ordered day in your classroom, an ordered day, a framework for learning, we provide a firm foundation for the souls we minister to. When we have that ordered day in the classroom, when that little child coming into the classroom knows the order of the day, they know what is going to happen, they are secure and they can learn. If you have children coming into your classroom and they never know what's going to happen, that's very unhealthy. That order, God has made us this way, right? It's good for us to have routines. And so we have that order in the classroom, and the child comes in, they know it's coming, they can relax. It's taken care of. Now I can just learn. That's a very, very, very good thing. And it helps their minds. It helps to train their mind to think clearly and orderly, and prepares them for the logic they will take later on, right? When they get to the logic stage. So much to think about there. I just think that teachers in classrooms need to realize how wonderful and huge your job is. It's extremely huge. When we read Anne of Green Gables, you know, some people say we bury our head in the sands. Oh, you classicist. You think life is just beautiful, truth, beauty, goodness. No, we're not burying our head. When we read Anne of Green Gables, we do not shy from the fact that her life is difficult, even sad. She's an orphan. Nobody loves her. Nobody wants her. People have mistreated her. She doesn't even have a friend. She has to have a window friend, right? But we deal with the hope that things may get better. And that even in the midst of difficulties, we must hold our head up high and do our duty. She is unbeatable, right? When our little children walk into a beautifully drawn world of Peter Rabbit, in our curriculum is in 2nd grade, which the vocabulary in Peter Rabbit is actually higher than you would think. But anyway, they learn that Peter, like themselves, sometimes strays. And that mother is always there to not only provide needed correction, but to tuck one into bed, as only a mother can. Not every child will have that experience, which makes it even more important for them to know it exists. Don't take it away from them. If they have a bad home life, don't say, I can't show them a good home life. That's not going to hurt them. It's going to help them. So let's not apologize for beauty and goodness, right? When in later years we read Anna Karenina, we see how a foolish heart can wreak havoc and how a gentle soul can gain great joy in living the simple life. We see God's goodness and man's capriciousness, and we wish to fall firmly on the side of that goodness. Do you see what classical literature does? This is why, there's so many schools, public schools, who have tossed this all out because it's written by dead white men. And I just think, you poor people, you've missed so much. Oh, the joy and privilege of the teacher in a classical school, surrounded by the very best of books, the most beautiful music, the sounds of Latin floating through the air. I hope you have that. It is a truly delightful place. Do you not think your students see this too? And they grow to appreciate the order and structure of a well-run classroom. In the chaos of a world eschewing order, their school day is one of blessed quietness and gentle learning. That's a beautiful place to be in a really kind of messy world. Let them come into your classroom and enter and breathe deeply and say, I'm in a good place all day long, right? And yet, if we rely only on our classical pedagogy, our rules of behavior, the structure and order in our classrooms, all of which are important and needed, we will still be lacking. For there's one thing we must never forget. A converted soul is a soul that can be used for God. As teachers and leaders of classical education, we must spend more time in prayer for the souls of our students. The grandest education will point them in the right direction. It will soften the heart to truth, but only true conversion will produce the virtuous soul that is needed in this world. I think in the 70s we had the big Christian school movement, and we missed the boat because we said, have a memorize scripture and do these 10 things. And that's not in here, right? Those are still works. So we want to really deal with that soul. This is the end result we hope and pray for, the sine non qua, the thing that is absolutely necessary. Yet, it is not a guaranteed result. So you will do your best and you will give your all. We do what we do because it is right. Not because of the result, not because we're going to get paid money, not because of anything. We are honorable and do it because it's right. And that is a very different thought in these days when all are encouraged to simply do what they wish and avoid any adherence to rightness. It's a call to duty and honor. Do it because it's right. Classical education is beautiful. It's beautiful in its fullness, in its depth, its broadness, its firmness, its oldness, its enduring value. It's beautiful in its everything, and we are blessed to be a part of that. You don't know how many schools I see traveling around the West, all kinds of classical Christian schools springing up. I'm telling you, Southern California, in the midst of this dreadful time, there is a school there that is amazing. It's a school, I think she has probably about 140 kids now. And they met outside. They rent from a church, and they met outside all last year. Because, we're in a drought in the West forever. But beautiful weather. And the only way they could meet was to meet outside. They moved their desks outside. They said, we will not be defeated by these laws that say we have to pay thousands of dollars for infiltration system, blah, 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 blah. So they met outside and had a beautiful year. Their schools have doubled in size. What Satan meant for evil, God used it for good. And so it's been really encouraging to see these wonderful schools where people just don't give up and they just keep going forward. And sometimes you think, I don't even know how they're doing that. Little school in El Paso, Texas, El Paso Christian. She was on our Zoom meeting when we had that one regional. Or not Zoom, but whatever we used at the time. Yeah. In a poor section of that city, which it's got poor sections, border town, parents are poor, and yet, and Texas doesn't have like a voucher system or anything like that, and so, but they keep going, and they were really closed down, that city, this year. So it's amazing the work that you see being done all over the United States. It's really, really good. Recently, I read the life story of Yonmi Park. Have you read that? I think it's entitled A Life to Live, or her name is Yonmi, Yeonmi. Don't even try to phonetically do that because she's South Korean. Well, was from North Korea, but Yonmi Park, Park. She escaped from North Korea in through China and then eventually got to South Korea. I mean, you'll read the book. It's a harrowing experience, basically eating bugs to live and all this sort of thing. And she gets to South Korea, and she and her mother are working very hard at a restaurant. And when she's not working, she's in this little tiny room with no windows, studying, because she wants to learn and get an education, and then she wants to go to America. And she's so looking forward to the freedom of America and how wonderful it will be, not like it was in North Korea where you couldn't say certain things and you were just put upon all the time. And then she gets to America, and she is accepted into, was it Columbia? I believe so. And she gets to class, and she's so excited, and she starts to talk, and then she's told, don't use certain pronouns. And she says to herself, all that we suffered. And then I achieved, I got here. And now they're controlling me just like the North Korean government. They're controlling her speech, right? You can look her up online. She tells her story of escape from North Korea. But one thing she said was that when she learned the English language, the Korean language is smaller and it does not have as many descriptive words. And when she learned English, it just grew her world. It was amazing, all of these words, descriptive words, it was wonderful, and it grew her mind. And then she begins to read the great books. Now, some would say she shouldn't read the great books because after all, the whole CRT thing, dead white men and all that. She said, these books are so wonderful. They develop me so. Everybody should read these great stories, these great books. It has nothing to do with what color you are. Good is good, right? And she's just cannot get enough of it. And she's totally amazed at how these books are available and they're not being read. So it sometimes takes someone from somewhere else to come in and say to us, you're really blessed. Do something with it, right? Chesterton talks about words, and she talks about vocabulary and how it's so important to know words. And Chesterton talks about words. Chesterton, I feel like he's my friend. I think he's one of the most magnanimous of people ever, and he would tell you that too if he were alive. He says, you know, he weighed like 350 pounds. He was a very large man. And he said, I think I'm the most polite of all men because when I give up my seat on the bus, I give up 3 seats. So, I mean, he's a good man. And he says this, what is the good of words if they aren't important enough to quarrel over? Why do we choose one word more than another if there isn't any difference between them? If you're not going to argue about words, what are you going to argue about? He knew that standards in speech are important, and one of the ways we establish order in our society. So if you are ever tempted to say, I don't have to speak properly, or if you do speak properly and you're tempted to tone down your speech and be a little more normal, don't do it. Because words, our language brings order in our society. Understood rules of language are important. When language is devalued, our communication falters and we are less likely to understand one another. This is what you're doing in your classrooms. You are helping these children to master the art of the English language. Without rules of speech, we do not present ourselves well, and this often leads to coarse or undeveloped use of words in our conversation. I think if you listen to our conversation now, and you listen to conversation even 50 years ago, people had a better education and spoke more clearly. Their vocabulary was more lifted. We should never apologize for speaking properly or obtaining knowledge. And I know that's kind of the in thing to do. You know, nobody wants to be like, oh, I know a lot. Oh, so you know a lot. I'm glad for you. That's a good thing, right? There's nothing wrong with that. It is our duty to learn. It is our duty to learn. Every single one of us, forever and ever, the rest of our lives, will always be learning. We should always be learning. And if we are proclaiming to hold the standard, which in classical education, that's what we're doing. We're saying this is excellent education. We are saying there's a standard, and if we are saying that, then we need to live that. Our speech ought to show that. One of the benefits of a classical education is that each student develops a sensitivity to words, and I'm going to just hit the Latin thing just a little bit for you. I won't go too far. I know some people struggle, but when you study Latin, and you see those verb endings changing, and you're noticing words, and children are seeing derivatives, they begin to notice words. You don't have to tell them to do that. They simply begin to notice words. They begin to learn their Latin vocabulary, and then they're reading a book, and then suddenly, oh, that comes from the Latin. Yeah, it does. Oh, I noticed that word. Yeah, you did, and I didn't tell you to notice it. You have intentional readers, and you didn't even bring that about. They were learning some Latin and they saw this word related to the other. So it helps their reading. It helps them to notice words, and we really need to notice words. So that's one of the benefits of our education is we want our children to be sensitive to words, to notice them, to love them. We know that words are powerful, and the person who knows how to wield them will have sway over the situation. How many times have we seen that? The person who knows how to use words well, people follow them. This is part of, even if we study Cicero's rules of rhetoric, you have to know how to use your words to persuade people, right? So I think we would all agree that language is under attack. Would you say that in our present culture? Can we all agree on that? Every time you send that text where you substitute one letter for a word, whole word, do you do that? Oh, don't tell me you do. I don't want to hear about it. But every time we do that, we are relegating language to a very small box. We are saying language doesn't matter, right? And I won't even go down the subject of emojis. There was a language, it was called English. We didn't feel we had to soften an email or text by putting a little happy face there. We actually used our words. Cavemen, they drew on walls. They used pictures. Then we progressed and we learned how to read and write. It was an amazing thing. Now we're going back the other way. When we look back even 80 years, which is not a very long time, we can see that the beauty of language still retained a modicum of respect. Wise people have told us that when we write, we should share what we know. And so, just briefly, I'm going to share with you some of the ways that I learned to love words, and maybe you can think about things in your life and how you learned to love words, because I know you all do. A flea and a fly and a flue were in prison, so what could they do? Said the flea, let us fly. Said the fly, let us flee. So they flew through a flaw in the flue. Did you follow that? This was one of the many limerick-like sayings I learned as I grew up in a family that loved words. Notice the understanding of words needed for the use of homonyms and ability to enjoy word play. Explaining this to a child as he learns the limerick encourages an attention to words and helps to develop an appreciation for the intricacies of the English language. I have a son-in-law who's Russian, and they didn't come back to the States till he was 38. And, you know, it's hard to learn English, and it's hard to learn English as an adult, right? And he is always struggling with these words like, you know, flee and flee. What in the world? It's hard. It's really difficult. In days gone by, before screens reigned supreme, adults and children played with words. They did. That's what they did. There are numerous little ditties my mother used to teach us. It was very lovely and very good. This was why parents used to read, well, it wasn't why, but it happened. They would sing lullabies or read little nursery rhymes with the children, right? You weren't just having the nursery rhyme. That nursery rhyme was forming that child's sensitivity to rhyme and rhythm and poetry and all of that beautiful stuff. King James Version of the Bible that they heard from the time they were a baby. Don't toss it. It's beautiful language. And because of that, they had a better grasp of language. So we've tossed it all, and now we struggle. And that was so easy to do. Just read beautiful things to your children, and you gave them a head start with phonics. The language of hymns lifted our understanding of words. Hymns, okay? And as we sang, listen to these words. This is lifted for our present day. Though the angry surges roll o'er my tempest-driven soul, I am peaceful, for I know wildly though the winds may blow, I've an anchor safe and sure that will evermore endure. For it holds, my anchor holds. Blow your wildest then, O gale, on my bark so small and frail. By his grace I shall not fail. For my anchor holds, my anchor holds. Lifted vocabulary for this day and age. At Christmas time, we learned history as we sang the words of Henry Wadsworth Longfellow's I Heard the Bells on Christmas Day. Written during the dark years of the Civil War era. You know, he was an abolitionist. And he struggled with the pain the country was going through. It just he was broken. His one son had been wounded in the Civil War, and he was really struggling. And he shared his unbeatable hopefulness in the triumph of truth. He says, I heard the bells on Christmas Day, their old familiar carols play, and mild and sweet, their songs repeat of peace on earth, goodwill to men. And in despair, I bowed my head. There is no peace on earth, I said, for hate is strong and mocks the song of peace on earth, goodwill to men. Then rang the bells more loud and deep. God is not dead, nor doth he sleep. The wrong shall fail, the right prevail, with peace on earth, goodwill to men. We were reminded of love, of family, and the beauty of parenthood, while also becoming comfortable with the rhythm and rhyme of poetry. When we memorized Henry Wadsworth's poem about his daughters, as he explains bedtime in the Longfellow household, and he paints a picture of his little girls sneaking up behind him in his study and throwing their arms around him in the children's hour. Do you know this poem? It's a lovely poem. My children can all recite this because it's just so important. Between the dark and the daylight, when the night is beginning to lower, comes, now picture yourself and your children in your home, comes a pause in the day's occupation that is known as the children's hour. I hear in the chamber above me the patter of little feet, the sound of a door that is opened, and voices soft and sweet. He's down here in his study. His little girls are upstairs. I see in the lamplight above me descending the broad hall stair, grave Alice and laughing Allegra, and Edith with golden hair. A whisper and then a silence, yet I know by their merry eyes they are plotting and planning together to take me by surprise. A sudden rush from the stairway, a sudden raid from the hall. By 3 doors left unguarded, they enter my castle wall. They climb up into my turret or the arms and back of my chair. If I try to escape, they surround me. They seem to be everywhere. They almost devour me with kisses, their arms about me entwine. Is this not a happy father? And happy girls? And it's okay to put that out there. Don't be defeated by the harshness of the world. Let them see this. Let your students see this. We rejoiced in the beauty of Robert Frost's words as he described his Northeast experience when we read stopping by woods on a snowy evening. Whose woods these are, I think I know. His house is in the village, though. He will not see me stopping here to watch his woods fill up with snow. My little horse must think it queer to stop without a farmhouse near, between the woods and frozen lake, the darkest evening of the year. He gives his harness bells a shake, if you've ever had horses. And you know, with their reins, their bridle, or if they're hooked up. He gives his harness bells a shake to ask if there's some mistake. The only other sounds, quiet snowy evening. The only other sounds, the sweep of easy wind and downy flake. The woods are lovely, dark and deep, but I have promises to keep and miles to go before I sleep. Miles to go before I sleep. His words carried us miles away. It seemed as if we were in those chilly woods with gentle snowflakes falling around us, and you can picture that with Robert Frost. St. Thomas Aquinas tells us, beware the man of a single book. Let us not be that person. Let us be the people who delve into books. True education involves the study of poetry. It involves recitation and scripture memorization. And each of these things leads the student to a love of words. When you read aloud to your students, when you teach Latin derivatives, when you conjugate verbs, and you teach phonics, you are helping your students to love words. Chesterton was not afraid to speak of the importance of language, and neither should we be. He says, our generation, and he's been gone a long time now, our generation professes to be scientific. And isn't that just it? How much have we heard about science this year? Follow the science, whatever. Our generation professes to be scientific in particular about the things it says. But unfortunately, it is never scientific in particular about the words with which it says them. It is difficult to believe that people who are obviously careless about language can really be careful about anything else. He's right. We need to be careful and even protective of our language. We need to care enough to think about words and to love them. Please think about your words in your classrooms. Please use lifted vocabulary. Please expect your children not to use double negatives, and for goodness sake, please don't ever use them yourself. Right? So important. How about if they thought of other descriptive words, other adjectives beside the dreadful awesome, right? Could we do magnificent? Could we do wonderful? Could we do marvelous? Could we bring back some of these real words? We could do that. We could do that, and that's your job. So because our society has lost its ability to communicate fully, we are somewhat like babes, wanting to speak, and yet lacking a full understanding of language. Picture the 2-year-old frustratingly trying to communicate. And you know how that can be. With each word he learns, he feels better because he can communicate to his mom, right? When a person is able to communicate fully, when he's able to put his thoughts together in an orderly fashion, a sense of calm is restored. And I do sometimes feel sorry for a lot of people who are very angry in our society in these days, because some of it's just wrongness and just being bad, but some of it is never learning how to communicate and have a discussion where you can have different opinions but not hurt each other. You could just be able to discuss things, right? And so they've never been equipped in that way to be able to do that. And that's very, very, very sad. As we see our society struggle with a lack of order and a lack of satisfaction in the status quo, Latin word, and that means the state in which we find ourselves, it seems the art of civil discourse has disappeared. What would be the case if students were taught to value words, to take words apart, that there are rules that must be followed in language, never changing, rules, that's it, no changing, no exception? I would suggest that the understanding the importance of language would naturally cause students to exhibit a deeper love of communication as they learn how to handle words in a responsible manner. Well, I've talked a lot about words. I've talked a lot about words. I've used words to talk, right? And that's what you do every day in your classroom. And if you're a head of school, that's what you do with your staff. And so let us learn to value words, to love words, and to be careful with our words, that we use them properly and fully. Because when you use them in your classroom or in your school the right way, they have so much effect on everything that comes out of your school. I will leave you with this. I was the head of a school in Arizona, and one of my teachers came in and she was chatting with me, and she said to me, said something, and then she said, "Oh, I'm sorry. I always watch my words around you." That's okay. If you're head of school, yeah, that's perfectly all right. And if you're a teacher in a classroom, you make those children feel like they need to watch their words around you. You lift them up, you raise the bar, right? It's important that we do that. Okay, thank you for your patience and your goodness and for attending. And I hope that this is of help to you somehow.